And it shall come to pass that what men made shall be shattered, and the shadow shall lie across the pattern of the age, and the Dark One shall once more lay his hand upon the world of man. Women shall weep and men quail as the nations of the earth are rent like rotting cloth. Neither shall anything stand nor abide. Yet one shall be born to face the shadow, born once more as he was born before, and shall be born again time without end. The dragon shall be reborn, and there shall be wailing and gnashing of teeth at his rebirth. In sackcloth and ashes shall he clothe the people, and he shall break the world again by his coming, tearing apart all ties that bind. Like the unfettered dawn shall he blind us and burn us. Yet shall the dragon reborn confront the shadow at the last battle, and his blood shall give us the light. Let tears flow, O ye people of the world. Weep for your salvation. From the Koreathon Cycle, The Prophecies of the Dragon, as translated by Elaine Marisaidine Alshin, Chief Librarian at the Court of Arafel in the year of grace 231 of the new era, the Third Age. Prologue. In the Shadow. The man who called himself Bors, at least in this place, sneered at the low murmuring that rolled around the vaulted chamber like the soft gabble of geese. His grimace was hidden by the black silk mask that covered his face, though, just like the masks that covered the 100 other faces in the chamber. 100 black masks and 100 pairs of eyes trying to see what lay behind them. If one did not look too closely, the room could have been in a palace, with its tall marble fireplaces and its golden lamps hanging from the domed ceiling, its colorful tapestries and intricately patterned mosaic floor. If one did not look too closely. The fireplaces were cold, for one thing. Flames danced on logs as thick as a man's leg, but gave no heat. The walls behind the tapestries, the ceiling high above the lamps, were undressed stone, almost black. There were no windows and only 2 doorways, one at either end of the room. It was as if someone had intended to give the semblance of a palace reception chamber, but had not cared enough to bother with more than the outline and a few touches for detail. Where the chamber was, the man who called himself Bors did not know, nor did he think any of the others knew. He did not like to think about where it might be. It was enough that he had been summoned. He did not like to think about that either, but for such a summons, even he came. He shifted his cloak, thankful that the fires were cold, else it would have been too hot for the black wool draping him to the floor. All his clothes were black. The bulky folds of the cloak hid the stoop he used to disguise his height, and bred confusion as to whether he was thin or thick. He was not the only one there enveloped in a tailor's span of cloth. Silently he watched his companions. Patience had marked much of his life. Always, if he waited and watched long enough, someone made a mistake. Most of the men and women here might have had the same philosophy. They watched and listened silently to those who had to speak. Some people could not bear waiting or silence, and so gave away more than they knew. Servants circulated through the guests, slender, golden-haired youths, proffering wine with a bow and a wordless smile. Young men and young women alike, they wore tight white breeches and flowing white shirts. And male and female alike, they moved with disturbing grace. Each looked more than a mirror image of the others. The boys as handsome as the girls were beautiful. He doubted he could distinguish one from another, and he had an eye and a memory for faces. A smiling, white-clad girl offered her tray of crystal goblets to him. He took one with no intention of drinking. It might appear untrusting, or worse, and either could be deadly here, if he refused altogether, but anything could be slipped into a drink. Surely some among his companions would have no objections to seeing the number of their rivals for power dwindle, whomever the unlucky ones happened to be. Idly he wondered whether the servants would have to be disposed of after this meeting. Servants hear everything. As the serving girl straightened from her bow, his eye caught hers above that sweet smile. Blank eyes, empty eyes, a doll's eyes. Eyes more dead than death. He shivered as she moved gracefully away and raised the goblet to his lips before he caught himself. It was not what had been done to the girl that chilled him. Rather, every time he thought he detected a weakness in those he now served, he found himself preceded, the supposed weakness cut out with a ruthless precision that left him amazed and worried. The first rule of his life had always been to search for weakness. For every weakness was a chink where he could probe and pry and influence. If his current masters, his masters for the moment, had no weakness. Frowning behind his mask, he studied his companions. At least there was plenty of weakness there. Their nervousness betrayed them, even those who had sense enough to guard their tongues. A stiffness in the way this one held himself, a jerkiness in the way that one handled her skirts. A good quarter of them, he estimated, had not bothered with disguise beyond the black masks. Their clothes told much. A woman standing before a gold and crimson wall hanging, speaking softly to a figure, impossible to say whether it was man or woman, cloaked and hooded in gray. She had obviously chosen the spot because the colors of the tapestry set off her garb. Doubly foolish to draw attention to herself, for her scarlet dress, cut low in the bodice, to show too much flesh and high at the hem to display golden slippers, marked her from Ilion, and a woman of wealth, perhaps even of noble blood. Not far beyond the Ilioner, another woman stood, alone and admirably silent, with a swan's neck and lustrous black hair falling in waves below her waist. She kept her back to the stone wall, observing everything. No nervousness there, only serene self-possession. Very admirable, that, but her coppery skin and her creamy high-necked gown, leaving nothing but her hands uncovered, yet clinging and only just barely opaque, so that it hinted at everything and revealed nothing, marked her just as clearly of the first blood of Ara-Doman. And unless the man who called himself Bors missed his guess entirely, the wide golden bracelet on her left wrist bore her house symbols. That would be for her own house. No Domani bloodborn would bend her stiff pride enough to wear the sigils of another house. Worse than foolishness. A man in a high-collared sky-blue Shinaran coat passed him with a wary head-to-toe glance through the eye-holes of his mask. The man's carriage named him Soldier. The set of his shoulders, the way his gaze never rested in one place for long, and the way his hand seemed ready to dart for a sword that was not there, all proclaimed it. The Shinaran wasted little time on the man who called himself Bors. Stooped shoulders and a bent back held no threat. The man who called himself Bors snorted as the Shinaran moved on, right hand clenching and eyes already studying elsewhere for danger. He could read them all, to class and country. Merchant and warrior, commoner and noble. From Kandor and Kyrian, Saldaea and Giladon. From every nation and nearly every people. His nose wrinkled in sudden disgust. Even a tinker in bright green breeches and a virulent yellow coat. We can do without those come the day. The disguised ones were no better, many of them cloaked and shrouded as they were. He caught sight, under the edge of one dark robe, of the silver-worked boots of a High Lord of Tyr, and under another, a glimpse of golden lion-head spurs worn only by high officers in the Andorran Queen's Guards. A slender fellow, slender even in a floor-dragging black robe and an anonymous gray cloak, caught with a plain silver pin, watched from the shadows of his deep cowl. He could be anyone from anywhere, except for the six-pointed star tattooed on the web between thumb and forefinger of his right hand. One of the sea folk, then. And a look at his left hand would show the marks of his clan and line. The man who called himself Bors did not bother to try. Suddenly his eyes narrowed, fixing on a woman, enveloped in black till nothing showed but her fingers. On her right hand rested a gold ring in the shape of a serpent eating its own tail. Aes Sedai, or at least a woman trained in Tar Valon by Aes Sedai. None else would wear that ring. Either way made no difference to him. He looked away before she could notice his watching, and almost immediately he spotted another woman swathed from head to toe in black and wearing a great serpent ring. The two witches gave no sign that they knew each other. In the White Tower, they sat like spiders in the middle of a web, pulling the strings that made kings and queens dance, meddling. Curse them all to death eternal. He realized that he was grinding his teeth. If numbers must dwindle, and they must before the day, there were some who would be missed even less than tinkers. A chime sounded, a single shivering note that came from everywhere at once and cut off all other sounds like a knife. The tall doors at the far end of the chamber swung open, and two Trollocs stepped into the room, spikes decorating the black mail that hung to their knees. Everyone shied back, even the man who called himself Bors. Head and shoulders taller than the tallest man there, they were a stomach-turning blend of man and animal, human faces twisted and altered. One had a heavy, pointed beak where his mouth and nose should have been, and feathers covered his head instead of hair. The other walked on hooves, his face pushed out in a hairy muzzle, and goat horns stuck up above his ears. Ignoring the humans, the Trollocs turned back toward the door and bowed, servile and cringing. The feathers on the one lifted in a tight crest. A Myrddraal stepped between them, and they fell to their knees. It was garbed in black that made the Trollocs' mail and the humans' masks seem bright, garments that hung still without a ripple. The man who called himself Bors felt his lips drawing back over his teeth, half snarl and half, he was ashamed to admit even to himself, fear. It had its face uncovered, its pasty, pale face, a man's face, but eyeless as an egg, like a maggot in a grave. The smooth white face swiveled, regarding them all one by one, it seemed. A visible shiver ran through them under that eyeless look. Thin, bloodless lips quirked in what might almost have been a smile, as one by one the masked ones tried to press back into the crowd, milling to avoid that gaze. The Myrddraal's look shaped them into a semicircle facing the door. The one who called himself Bors swallowed. There will come a day, half-man, when the great Lord of the Dark comes again. He will choose his new dreadlords, and you will cower before them. You will cower before men, before me. Why doesn't it speak? Stop staring at me and speak. Your master comes. The Myrddraal's voice rasped like a dry snakeskin crumbling. To your bellies, worms. Grovel lest his brilliance blind and burn you. Rage filled the man who called himself Bors at the tone as much as the words. But then the air above the halfman shimmered, and the import drove home. It can't be. It can't. The Trollocs were already on their bellies, writhing as if they wanted to burrow into the floor. Without waiting to see if anyone else moved, the man who called himself Bors dropped face down, grunting as he bruised himself on the stone. Words sprang to his lips like a charm against danger. They were a charm, though a thin reed against what he feared. And he heard 100 other voices, breathy with fear, speaking the same against the floor. The great Lord of the Dark is my master, and most heartily do I serve him to the last shred of my very soul. In the back of his mind, a voice chattered with fear. The Dark One and all the Forsaken are bound. Shivering, he forced it to silence. He had abandoned that voice long since. Lo, my master is death's master. Asking nothing do I serve against the day of his coming, yet do I serve in the sure and certain hope of life everlasting. Bound in Shale Ghul, bound by the Creator at the moment of creation. No, I serve a different master now. Surely the faithful shall be exalted in the land, exalted above the unbelievers, exalted above thrones. Yet do I serve humbly against the day of his return. The hand of the Creator shelters us all, and the light protects us from the shadow. No, a different master. Swift come the day of return. Swift come the great Lord of the Dark to guide us and rule the world forever and ever. The man who called himself Bors finished the creed, panting, as if he had run 10 miles. The rasp of breath all around him told him he was not the only one. Rise, all of you, rise. The mellifluous voice took him by surprise. Surely none of his companions, lying on their bellies with their masked faces pressed to the mosaic tiles, would have spoken, but it was not the voice he expected from. Cautiously, he raised his head enough to see with one eye. The figure of a man floated in the air above the Myrddraal, the hem of his blood-red robe hanging a span over the halfman's head. Masked and blood-red, too. Would the great Lord of the Dark appear to them as a man? And masked, besides? Yet the Myrddraal, its very gaze fear, trembled and almost cowered where it stood in the figure's shadow. The man who called himself Bors grasped for an answer his mind could contain without splitting. One of the Forsaken, perhaps. That thought was only a little less painful. Even so, it meant the day of the Dark One's return must be close at hand, if one of the Forsaken was free. The Forsaken. 13 of the most powerful wielders of the One Power in an age filled with powerful wielders had been sealed up in Shale Ghul along with the Dark One, sealed away from the world of men by the dragon and the 100 companions. And the backblast of that sealing had tainted the male half of the true source. And all the male Aes Sedai, those cursed wielders of the power, went mad and broke the world, tore it apart like a pottery bowl smashed on rocks, ending the age of legends before they died, rotting while they still lived. A fitting death for Aes Sedai, to his mind. Too good for them. He regretted only that the women had been spared. Slowly, painfully, he forced the panic to the back of his mind, confined it and held it tight, though it screamed to get out. It was the best he could do. None of those on their bellies had risen, and only a few had even dared raise their heads. Rise! There was a snap in the red-masked figure's voice this time. He gestured with both hands. Stand! The one who called himself Bors scrambled up awkwardly, But halfway to his feet, he hesitated. Those gesturing hands were horribly burned, crisscrossed by black fissures, the raw flesh between as red as the figure's robes. Would the Dark One appear so? Even one of the Forsaken? The eye holes of that blood-red mask swept slowly across him, and he straightened hastily. He thought he could feel the heat of an open furnace in that gaze. The others obeyed the command with no more grace and no less fear in their rising. When all were on their feet, the floating figure spoke. "I have been known by many names, but the one by which you shall know me is Baalzamon." The man who called himself Bors clamped his teeth to keep them from chattering. Baalzamon. In the Trolloc tongue, it meant Heart of the Dark, and even unbelievers knew it was the Trolloc name for the great Lord of the Dark. He whose name must not be uttered. Not the true name, Shaitan, but still forbidden. Among those gathered here, and others of their kind, to sully either with a human tongue was blasphemy. His breath whistled through his nostrils, and all around him he could hear others panting behind their masks. The servants were gone, and the Trollocs as well, though he had not seen them go. "The place where you stand lies in the shadow of Sheol-Ghul." More than one voice moaned at that. The man who called himself Bors was not sure his own was not among them. A touch of what might almost be called mockery entered Baalzamon's voice as he spread his arms wide. "Fear not, for the day of your master's rising upon the world is near at hand. The day of return draws nigh. Does it not tell you so that I am here, to be seen by you, favored few, among your brothers and sisters? Soon the wheel of time will be broken. Soon the great serpent will die, and with the power of that death, the death of time itself, your master will remake the world in his own image for this age and for all ages to come. And those who serve me, faithful and steadfast, will sit at my feet above the stars in the sky and rule the world of men forever. So have I promised, and so shall it be without end. You shall live and rule forever." A murmur of anticipation ran through the listeners, and some even took a step forward toward the floating crimson shape, their eyes lifted, rapturous. Even the man who called himself Bors felt the pull of that promise, the promise for which he had dealt away his soul 100 times over. "The day of return comes closer," Baalzamon said. "But there is much yet to do. Much to do." The air to Baalzamon's left shimmered and thickened, and the figure of a young man hung there, a little lower than Baalzamon. The man who called himself Bors could not decide whether it was a living being or not. A country lad, by his clothes, with a light of mischief in his brown eyes and the hint of a smile on his lips, as if in memory or anticipation of a prank. The flesh looked warm, but the chest did not move with breath. The eyes did not blink. The air to Baalzamon's right wavered as if with heat, and a second country-clad figure hung suspended a little below Baalzamon. A curly-haired youth, as heavily muscled as a blacksmith. And an oddity. A battle axe hung at his side, a great steel half-moon, balanced by a thick spike. The man who called himself Bors suddenly leaned forward, intent on an even greater strangeness. A youth with yellow eyes. For the third time, air solidified into the shape of a young man, this time directly under Baalzamon's eye, almost at his feet. A tall fellow with eyes now gray, now almost blue as the light took them, and dark reddish hair. Another villager or farmer. The man who called himself Bors gasped. Yet another thing out of the ordinary, though he wondered why he should expect anything to be ordinary here. A sword swung from the figure's belt, a sword with a bronze heron on the scabbard, and another inset into the long two-handed hilt. A village boy with a heron-mark blade? Impossible. What can it mean? And a boy with yellow eyes? He noticed the Myrddraal looking at the figures, trembling. And unless he misjudged entirely, its trembling was no longer fear, but hatred. Dead silence had fallen, silence that Baalzamon let deepen before he spoke. There is now one who walks the world. One who was and will be, but is not yet the dragon. A startled murmur ran through his listeners. We are to kill him, great lord? That from the Shienaran, hand grasping eagerly at his side where his sword would hang. Perhaps, Baalzamon said simply. And perhaps not. Perhaps he can be turned to my use. Sooner or later it will be so, in this age or another. The man who called himself Bors blinked. In this age or another? I thought the day of return was near. What mattered to me what happens in another age if I grow old and die waiting in this one? But Baalzamon was speaking again. Already a bend is forming in the pattern, one of many points where he who will become the dragon may be turned to my service. Must be turned. Better that he serve me alive than dead, but alive or dead, serve me he must and will. These three you must know, for each is a thread in the pattern I mean to weave. And it will be up to you to see that they are placed as I command. Study them well, that you will know them. Abruptly, all sound was gone. The man who called himself Bors shifted uneasily, and saw others doing the same. All but the Ilianer woman, he realized. With her hands spread over her bosom, as if to hide the rounded flesh she exposed, eyes wide, half frightened and half ecstatic, she was nodding eagerly, as though to someone face to face with her. Sometimes she appeared to give a reply, but the man who called himself Bors heard not a word. Suddenly she arched backwards, trembling and rising on her toes. He could not see why she did not fall, unless something unseen held her. Then, just as abruptly, she settled back to her feet and nodded again, bowing, shivering. Even as she straightened, one of the women wearing a great serpent ring gave a start and began nodding. So each of us hears his own instructions, and none hears another's. The man who called himself Bors muttered in frustration. If he knew what even one other was commanded, he might be able to use the knowledge to advantage. But this way... Impatiently he waited for his turn, forgetting himself enough to stand straight. One by one the gathering received their orders, each walled in silence, yet still giving tantalizing clues, if only he could read them. The man of the Ata Anmier, the sea folk, stiffening with reluctance as he nodded. The Shienaran, his stance bespeaking confusion even while he acquiesced. The second woman of Tavirin giving a start, as of shock, and the gray-swathed figure, whose sex he could not determine, shaking its head, before falling to its knees and nodding vigorously. Some underwent the same convulsion as the Ilianer woman, as if pain itself lifted them to toe tips. Boars. The man who called himself Boars jerked as a red mask filled his eyes. He could still see the room, still see the floating shape of Baalzamon and the three figures before him. But at the same time, all he could see was the red-masked face. Dizzy, he felt as if his skull were splitting open and his eyes were being pushed out of his head. For a moment, he thought he could see flames through the eye holes of the mask. "Are you faithful, Boars?" The hint of mocking in the name sent a chill down his backbone. "I am faithful, great lord. I cannot hide from you. I am faithful, I swear it." "No, you cannot." The certainty in Baalzamon's voice dried his mouth, but he forced himself to speak. "Command me, great lord, and I obey." "Firstly, you are to return to Taraban and continue your good works. In fact, I command you to redouble your efforts." He stared at Baalzamon in puzzlement, but then fires flared again behind the mask, and he took the excuse of a bow to pull his eyes away. "As you command, great lord, so shall it be." "Secondly, you will watch for the three young men and have your followers watch. Be warned, they are dangerous." The man who called himself Boris glanced at the figures floating in front of Baalzamon. "How can I do that? I can see them, but I can't see anything except his face." His head felt about to burst. Sweat slicked his hands under his thin gloves, and his shirt clung to his back. "Dangerous, great lord. Farm boys. Is one of them the... A sword is dangerous to the man at the point, but not to the man at the hilt. Unless the man holding the sword is a fool, or careless, or unskilled. In which case, it is twice as dangerous to him as to anyone else. It is enough that I have told you to know them. It is enough that you obey me." "As you command, great lord, so shall it be." "Thirdly, regarding those who have landed at Toman Head and the Domani, of this you will speak to no one. When you return to Taraban..." The man who called himself Boris realized as he listened that his mouth was sagging open. The instructions made no sense. If I knew what some of the others were told, perhaps I could piece it together. Abruptly, he felt his head grasped as though by a giant hand, crushing his temples. Felt himself being lifted, and the world blew apart in 1,000 starbursts, each flash of light becoming an image that fled across his mind or spun and dwindled into the distance before he could more than barely grasp it. An impossible sky of striated clouds, red and yellow and black, racing as if driven by the mightiest wind the world had ever seen. A woman, a girl, dressed in white, receded into blackness and vanished as soon as she appeared. A raven stared him in the eye, knowing him, and was gone. An armored man in a brutal helm, shaped and painted and gilded like some monstrous poisonous insect, raised a sword and plunged to one side beyond his view. A horn, curled and golden, came hurtling out of the far distance. One piercing note it sounded as it flashed toward him, tugging his soul. At the last instant, it flashed into a blinding golden ring of light that passed through him, chilling him beyond death. A wolf leaped from the shadows of lost sight and ripped out his throat. He could not scream. The torrent went on, drowning him, burying him. He could barely remember who he was or what he was. The skies rained fire and the moon and stars fell. Rivers ran in blood and the dead walked. The earth split open, and fountained molten rock. The man who called himself Bors found himself half crouching in the chamber with the others, most watching him, all silent. Wherever he looked, up or down or in any direction, the masked face of Baalzamon overwhelmed his eyes. The images that had flooded into his mind were fading. He was sure many were already gone from memory. Hesitantly, he straightened. Baalzamon always before him.
Great Lord, what?
Some commands are too important to be known, even by he who carries them out. The man who called himself Bors bent almost double in his bow.
As you command, great Lord,
he whispered hoarsely.
So shall it be.
When he straightened, he was alone in silence once more. Another, the Terran High Lord, nodded and bowed to someone none else saw. The man who called himself Bors put an unsteady hand to his brow, trying to hold on to something of what had burst through his mind, though he was not completely certain he wanted to remember. The last remnant flickered out, and suddenly he was wondering what it was that he was trying to recall. I know there was something, but what? There was something, wasn't there? He rubbed his hands together, grimacing at the feel of sweat under his gloves, and turned his attention to the three figures hanging suspended before Baalzamon's floating form. The muscular, curly-haired youth, the farmer with the sword, and the lad with a look of mischief on his face. Already in his mind, the man who called himself Bors had named them the blacksmith, the swordsman, and the trickster. What is their place in the puzzle? They must be important, or Baalzamon would not have made them the center of this gathering. But from his orders alone, they could all die at any time, and he had to think that some of the others, at least, had orders as deadly for the three. How important are they? Blue eyes could mean the nobility of Andor, unlikely in those clothes, and there were borderlanders with light eyes, as well as some Terrans, not to mention a few from Gillidan, and of course, no help there. But yellow eyes? Who are they? What are they? He started at a touch on his arm and looked around to find one of the white-clad servants, a young man, standing by his side. The others were back too, more than before, one for each of the masked. He blinked. Baalzamon was gone. The Myrddraal was gone too, and only rough stone was where the door it had used had been. The three figures still hung there, though. He felt as if they were staring at him. If it please you, my Lord Bors, I will show you to your room. Avoiding those dead eyes, he glanced once more at the three figures, then followed. Uneasily, he wondered how the youth had known what name to use. It was not until the strange carved doors closed behind him, and they had walked a dozen paces, that he realized he was alone in the corridor with the servant. His brows drew down suspiciously behind his mask, but before he could open his mouth, the servant spoke. The others are also being shown to their rooms, my lord. If you please, my lord. Time is short, and our master is impatient. The man who called himself Bors ground his teeth, both at the lack of information and at the implication of sameness between himself and the servant, but he followed in silence. Only a fool ranted at a servant, and worse, remembering the fellow's eyes, he was not sure it would do any good. And how did he know what I was going to ask? The servant smiled. The man who called himself Bors did not feel at all comfortable until he was back in the room where he had waited on first arriving, and then not much. Even finding the seals on his saddlebags untouched was small comfort. The servant stood in the hallway, not entering. You may change to your own garments if you wish, my lord. None will see you depart here, nor arrive at your destination. but it may be best to arrive already properly clothed. Someone will come soon to show you the way." Untouched by any visible hand, the door swung shut. The man who called himself Bors shivered in spite of himself. Hastily he undid the seals and buckles of his saddlebags and pulled out his usual cloak. In the back of his mind, a small voice wondered if the promised power, even the immortality, was worth another meeting like this, but he laughed it down immediately. For that much power, I would praise the great Lord of the Dark under the Dome of Truth. Remembering the commands given him by Baalzamon, he fingered the golden flaring sun worked on the breast of the white cloak, and the red shepherd's crook behind the sun, symbol of his office in the world of men. And he almost laughed. There was work, great work, to be done in Taraban and on Almouth Plain. Chapter 1. The Flame of Tarvalon. The wheel of time turns, and ages come and pass, leaving memories that become legend, then fade to myth and are long forgot when that age comes again. In one age, called the Third Age by some, an age yet to come, an age long past, a wind rose in the mountains of doom. The wind was not the beginning. There are neither beginnings nor endings to the turning of the wheel of time. But it was a beginning. Born among black, knife-edged peaks, where death roamed the high passes, yet hid from things still more dangerous, the wind blew south across the tangled forest of the Great Blight, a forest tainted and twisted by the touch of the Dark One. The sickly, sweet smell of corruption faded by the time the wind crossed that invisible line men called the border of Shinar, where spring flowers hung thick in the trees. It should have been summer by now, but spring had been late in coming, and the land had run wild to catch up. New-come pale green bristled on every bush, and red new growth tipped every tree branch. The wind rippled farmers' fields like verdant ponds, solid with crops that almost seemed to creep upward visibly. The smell of death was all but gone long before the wind reached the stone-walled town of Faldara on its hills and whipped around a tower of the fortress in the very center of the town, a tower atop which two men seemed to dance. Hard-walled and high, Faldara both keep and town, never taken, never betrayed. The wind moaned across wood-shingled rooftops, around tall stone chimneys and taller towers, moaned like a dirge. Stripped to the waist, Randolph Thor shivered at the wind's cold caress, and his fingers flexed on the long hilt of the practice sword he held. The hot sun had slicked his chest, and his dark reddish hair clung to his head in a sweat-curled mat. A faint odor in the swirl of air made his nose twitch, but he did not connect the smell with the image of an old grave, fresh opened, that flashed through his head. He was barely aware of odor or image at all. He strove to keep his mind empty, but the other man sharing the tower top with him kept intruding on the emptiness. 10 paces across, the tower top was, encircled by a chest-high, crenellated wall. Big enough, and more, not to feel crowded, except when shared with a warder. Young as he was, Rand was taller than most men, but Lan stood just as tall and more heavily muscled, if not quite so broad in the shoulders. A narrow band of braided leather held the warder's long hair back from his face, a face that seemed made from stony planes and angles, a face unlined as if to belie the tinge of gray at his temples. Despite the heat and exertion, only a light coat of sweat glistened on his chest and arms. Rand searched Lan's icy blue eyes, hunting for some hint of what the other man intended. The warder never seemed to blink, and the practice sword in his hands moved surely and smoothly as he flowed from one stance to another. With a bundle of thin, loosely bound staves in place of a blade, the practice sword would make a loud crack when it struck anything, and leave a welt where it hit flesh. Rand knew all too well. 3 thin red lines stung on his ribs, and another burned his shoulder. It had taken all his efforts not to wear more decorations. Lan bore not a mark. As he had been taught, Rand formed a single flame in his mind and concentrated on it, trying to feed all emotion and passion into it, to form a void within himself, with even thought outside. Emptiness came. As was too often the case of late, it was not a perfect emptiness. The flame still remained, or some sense of light sending ripples through the stillness. But it was enough, barely. The cool peace of the void crept over him, and he was one with the practice sword, with the smooth stones under his boots, even with Lan. All was one, and he moved without thought in a rhythm that matched the waters, step for step and move for move. The wind rose again, bringing the ringing of bells from the town. Somebody still celebrating that spring has finally come. The extraneous thought fluttered through the void on waves of light, disturbing the emptiness, and as if the water could read Rand's mind, the practice sword whirled in Lan's hands. For a long minute, the swift clack, clack, clack of bundled laths meeting filled the tower top. Rand made no effort to reach the other man. It was all he could do to keep the water's strikes from reaching him. Turning Lan's blows at the last possible moment, he was forced back. Lan's expression never changed. The practice sword seemed alive in his hands. Abruptly, the water's swinging slash changed in mid-motion to a thrust. Caught by surprise, Rand stepped back, already wincing with the blow he knew he could not stop this time. The wind howled across the tower and trapped him. It was as if the air had suddenly gelled, holding him in a cocoon, pushing him forward. Time and motion slowed. Horrified, he watched Lan's practice sword drift toward his chest. There was nothing slow or soft about the impact. His ribs creaked as if he had been struck with a hammer. He grunted, but the wind would not allow him to give way. It still carried him forward instead. The laths of Lan's practice sword flexed and bent, ever so slowly it seemed to Rand, then shattered, sharp points oozing toward his heart, jagged laths piercing his skin. Pain lanced through his body. His whole skin felt slashed. He burned as though the sun had flared to crisp him like bacon in a pan. With a shout, he threw himself stumbling back, falling against the stone wall. Hand trembling, he touched the gashes on his chest and raised bloody fingers before his gray eyes in disbelief. "And what was that fool move, sheepherder?" Lan grated. "You know better by now, or should, unless you have forgotten everything I've tried to teach you. How badly are you?" He cut off as Rand looked up at him. "The wind." Rand's mouth was dry. It pushed me. It was solid as a wall." The warder stared at him in silence, then offered a hand. Rand took it and let himself be pulled to his feet. "Strange things can happen this close to the blight," Lan said finally, but for all the flatness of the words, he sounded troubled. That in itself was strange. Warders, those half-legendary warriors who served the Aes Sedai, seldom showed emotion, and Lan showed little even for a warder. He tossed the shattered lath sword aside and leaned against the wall, where their real swords lay, out of the way of their practice. "Not like that," Rand protested. He joined the other man, squatting with his back against the stone. That way the top of the wall was higher than his head, protection of a kind from the wind. If it was a wind. No wind had ever felt solid like that. Peace. Maybe not even in the blight. For someone like you, Lan shrugged as if that explained everything. How long before you leave, sheepherder? A month since you said you were going, and I thought you'd be 3 weeks gone by now. Rand stared up at him in surprise. He's acting like nothing happened. Frowning, he set down the practice sword and lifted his real sword to his knees, fingers running along the long leather-wrapped hilt inset with a bronze heron. Another bronze heron stood on the scabbard, and yet another was scribed in the sheathed blade. It was still a little strange to him that he had a sword. Any sword, much less one with a blade master's mark. He was a farmer from the Two Rivers, so far away now. Maybe far away forever now. He was a shepherd like his father. I was a shepherd. What am I now? And his father had given him a heron-marked sword. Tam is my father, no matter what anybody says. He wished his own thoughts did not sound as if he was trying to convince himself. Again, Lan seemed to read his mind. In the borderlands, sheepherder, if a man has the raising of a child, that child is his, and none can say different. Scowling, Rand ignored the warder's words. It was no one's business but his own. I want to learn how to use this. I need to. It had caused him problems, carrying a heron-marked sword. Not everybody knew what it meant, or even noticed it. But even so, a heron-marked blade, especially in the hands of a youth barely old enough to be called a man, still attracted the wrong sort of attention. I've been able to bluff sometimes, when I could not run, and I've been lucky besides. But what happens when I can't run, and I can't bluff, and my luck runs out? You could sell it, Lance said carefully. That blade is rare, even among heron-marked swords. It would fetch a pretty price. No! It was an idea he had thought of more than once, but he rejected it now for the same reason he always had, and more fiercely for coming from someone else. As long as I keep it, I have the right to call Tam my father. He gave it to me, and it gives me the right. I thought any heron-marked blade was rare. Lan gave him a sidelong look. Tam didn't tell you then? He must know. Perhaps he didn't believe. Many do not. He snatched up his own sword, almost the twin of Rand's except for the lack of herons, and whipped off the scabbard. The blade, slightly curved and single-edged, glittered silvery in the sunlight. It was the sword of the kings of Malkier. Lan did not speak of it. He did not even like others to speak of it. But Alan Mandragoran was Lord of the Seven Towers, Lord of the Lakes, and uncrowned King of Malkier. The Seven Towers were broken now, and the 1,000 Lakes the lair of unclean things. Malkier lay swallowed by the great blight, and of all the Malkiri lords, only one still lived. Some said Lan had become a warder, bonding himself to an Aes Sedai, so he could seek death in the blight and join the rest of his blood. Rand had indeed seen Lan put himself in harm's way, seemingly without regard for his own safety. But far beyond his own life and safety, he held those of Moiraine, the Aes Sedai who held his bond. Rand did not think Lan would truly seek death while Moiraine lived. Turning his blade in the light, Lan spoke. In the War of the Shadow, the One Power itself was used as a weapon, and weapons were made with the One Power. Some weapons use the one power. Things that could destroy an entire city at one blow, lay waste to the land for leagues. Just as well those were all lost in the breaking. Just as well no one remembers the making of them. But there were simpler weapons, too, for those who would face Myrddraal, and worse things the Dreadlords made, blade to blade. With the one power, Aes Sedai drew iron and other metals from the earth, smelted them, formed and wrought them, all with the power. Swords and other weapons, too. Many that survived the breaking of the world were destroyed by men who feared and hated Aes Sedai work, and others have vanished with the years. Few remain, and few men truly know what they are. There have been legends of them, swollen tales of swords that seem to have a power of their own. You've heard the Gleeman's tales. The reality is enough. Blades that will not shatter or break and never lose their edge. I've seen men sharpening them, playing at sharpening, as it were, but only because they could not believe a sword did not need it after use. All they ever did was wear away their oil stones. Those weapons the Aes Sedai made, and there will never be others. When it was done, war and age ended together, with the world shattered, with more dead unburied than were alive, and those alive fleeing, trying to find some place, any place, of safety, with every second woman weeping because she'd never see her husband or sons again. When it was done, the Aes Sedai who still lived swore they would never again make a weapon for one man to kill another. Every Aes Sedai swore it, and every woman of them since has kept that oath. Even the Red Ogier. And they care little what happens to any male. One of those swords, a plain soldier's sword, with a faint grimace, almost sad if the warder could be said to show emotion, he slid the blade back into its sheath, became something more. On the other hand, those made for Lord Generals, with blades so hard no bladesmith could mark them, yet marked already with a heron, those blades became sought after. Rand's hands jerked away from the sword propped on his knees. It toppled, and instinctively he grabbed it before it hit the floor stones. You mean Aes Sedai made this? I thought you were talking about your sword. Not all heron-marked blades are Aes Sedai work. Few men handle a sword with the skill to be named Blade Master and be awarded a heron-marked blade, but even so, not enough Aes Sedai blades remain for more than a handful to have one. Most come from master bladesmiths, the finest steel men can make, yet still wrought by a man's hands. But that one sheepherder, that one could tell a tale of 3,000 years or more. I can't get away from them, Rand said. Can I? He balanced the sword in front of him on scabbard point. It looked no different than it had before he knew. Aes Sedai work. But Tam gave it to me. My father gave it to me. He refused to think of how a Two Rivers shepherd had come by a heron-marked blade. There were dangerous currents in such thoughts, deeps he did not want to explore. Do you really want to get away, sheepherder? I'll ask again. Why are you not gone then? The sword. In 5 years I could make you worthy of it, make you a blade master. You have quick wrists, good balance, and you don't make the same mistake twice. But I do not have 5 years to give over to teaching you, and you do not have 5 years for learning. You have not even 1 year, and you know it. As it is, you will not stab yourself in the foot. You hold yourself as if the sword belongs at your waist, sheepherder, and most village bullies will sense it. But you've had that much almost since the day you put it on. So why are you still here? Matt and Perrin are still here, Rand mumbled. I don't want to leave before they do. I won't ever... I might not see them again for years, maybe. His head dropped back against the wall. Blood and ashes. At least they just think I'm crazy enough to go home with them. Half the time Nynaeve looks at me like I'm 6 years old and I've skinned my knee and she's going to make it better. The other half, she looks like she's seeing a stranger. One she might offend if she looks too closely at that. She's a wisdom, and besides that, I don't think she's ever been afraid of anything, but she... He shook his head. And Egwene? Burn me. She knows why I have to go, but every time I mention it, she looks at me, and I knot up inside and... He closed his eyes, pressing the sword hilt against his forehead, as if he could press what he was thinking out of existence. I wish... You wish everything could be the way it was, sheepherder? Or you wish the girl would go with you instead of to Tarvalon? You think she'll give up becoming an Aes Sedai for a life of wandering? With you? If you put it to her in the right way, she might. Love is an odd thing. Lance sounded suddenly weary. As odd a thing as there is. No. It was what he had been wishing, that she would want to go with him. He opened his eyes and squared his back and made his voice firm. No, I wouldn't let her come with me if she did ask. He could not do that to her. But Light, wouldn't it be sweet, just for a minute, if she said she wanted to? She gets muley stubborn if she thinks I'm trying to tell her what to do. But I can still protect her from that. He wished she were back home in Emmons Field, but all hope of that had gone the day Moiraine came to the Two Rivers. Even if it means she does become an Aes Sedai. The corner of his eye caught Lan's raised eyebrow, and he flushed. And that is all the reason? You want to spend as much time as you can with your friends from home before they go? That's why you're dragging your feet. You know what's sniffing at your heels. Rand surged angrily to his feet. All right, it's Moiraine. I wouldn't even be here if not for her, and she won't as much as talk to me. You'd be dead if not for her, sheepherder, Lan said flatly. But Rand rushed on. She tells me horrible things about myself. His knuckles whitened on the sword. That I'm going to go mad and die. And then suddenly, she won't even say 2 words to me. She acts as if I'm no different from the day she found me, and that smells wrong too. You want her to treat you like what you are? No, I don't mean that. Burn me, I don't know what I mean half the time. I don't want that. And I'm scared of the other. Now she's gone off somewhere, vanished. I told you she needs to be alone sometimes. It isn't for you or anyone else to question her actions. Without telling anybody where she was going, or when she'd be back, or even if she would be back. She has to be able to tell me something to help me, Lan. Something. She has to. If she ever comes back. She's back, sheepherder. Last night. But I think she has told you all she can. Be satisfied. You've learned what you can from her. With a shake of his head, Lan's voice became brisk. You certainly aren't learning anything standing there. Time for a little balance work. Go through parting the silk, beginning from heron waiting in the rushes. Remember that heron form is only for practicing balance. Anywhere but doing forms, it leaves you wide open. You can strike home from it if you wait for the other man to move first, but you'll never avoid his blade. She has to be able to tell me something, Lan. That wind, it wasn't natural, and I don't care how close to the blight we are. Heron waiting in the rushes, sheepherder. And mind your wrists. From the south came a faint peal of trumpets, a rolling fanfare suddenly growing louder, accompanied by the steady thrum-thrum-thrum-thrum of drums. For a moment, Rand and Lan stared at each other. Then the drums drew them to the tower wall to stare southward. The city stood on high hills, the land around the city walls cleared to ankle height for a full mile in all directions, and the keep covered the highest hill of all. From the tower top, Rand had a clear view across the chimneys and roofs to the forest. The drummers appeared first from the trees, a dozen of them, drums lifting as they stepped to their own beat, mallets whirling. Next came trumpeters, long, shining horns raised, still calling the flourish. At that distance, Rand could not make out the huge square banner whipping in the wind behind them. Lan grunted, though. The warder had eyes like a snow eagle. Rand glanced at him, but the warder said nothing, his eyes intent on the column emerging from the forest. Mounted men in armor rode out of the trees, and women a horseback, too. Then a palanquin borne by horses, one before and one behind, its curtains down, and more men on horseback. Ranks of men afoot, pikes rising above them like a bristle of long thorns, and archers with their bows held slanted across their chests, all stepping to the drums. The trumpets cried again. Like a singing serpent, the column wound its way toward Faldara. The wind flapped the banner, taller than a man, straight out to one side. As big as it was close enough now for Rand to see clearly. A swirl of colors that meant nothing to him, but at the heart of it, a shape like a pure white teardrop. His breath froze in his throat. The flame of Tar-Valon. Ingtar's with them. Lan sounded as if his thoughts were elsewhere. Back from his hunting at last. Been gone long enough. I wonder if he had any luck. Aes Sedai, Rand whispered when he finally could. All those women out there. Moiraine was Aes Sedai, yes, but he had traveled with her. And if he did not entirely trust her, at least he knew her. Or thought he did. But she was only one. So many Aes Sedai together and coming like this was something else again. He cleared his throat. When he spoke, his voice grated. Why so many, Lan? Why any at all? And with drums and trumpets and a banner to announce them. Aes Sedai were respected in Shinar, at least by most people, and the rest respectfully feared them. But Rand had been in places where it was different, where there was only the fear and often hate. Where he had grown up, some men at least spoke of Tar-Valon witches as they would speak of the Dark One. He tried to count the women, but they kept no ranks or order, moving their horses around to converse with one another, or with whoever was in the palanquin. Goosebumps covered him. He had traveled with Moiraine, and met another Aes Sedai, and he had begun to think of himself as worldly. Nobody ever left the Two Rivers, or almost nobody, but he had. He had seen things no one back in the Two Rivers had ever laid eyes on, done things they had only dreamed of, if they had dreamed so far. He had seen a queen and met the daughter heir of Andor, faced a Myrddraal and traveled the ways, and none of it had prepared him for this moment. Why so many? He whispered again. The Amyrlin seats come in person. Lan looked at him, his expression as hard and unreadable as a rock. Your lessons are done, sheepherder. He paused then, and Rand almost thought there was sympathy on his face. That could not be, of course. Better for you if you were a week gone. With that, the warder snatched up his shirt and disappeared down the ladder into the tower. Rand worked his mouth, trying to get a little moisture. He stared at the column approaching Faldara as if it really were a snake, a deadly viper. The drums and trumpets sang loud in his ears. The Amyrlin seat who ordered the Aes Sedai. She's come because of me. He could think of no other reason. They knew things, had knowledge that could help him, he was sure. And he did not dare ask any of them. He was afraid they had come to gentle him. And afraid they haven't, too, he admitted reluctantly. Light, I don't know which scares me more. I don't mean to channel the power, he whispered. It was an accident. Light, I don't want anything to do with it. I swear I'll never touch it again, I swear it. With his start, he realized that the Aes Sedai party was entering the city gates. The wind swirled up fiercely, chilling his sweat like droplets of ice, making the trumpets sound like sly laughter. He thought he could smell an opened grave strong in the air. My grave if I keep standing here. Grabbing his shirt, he scrambled down the ladder and began to run. Chapter 2. The Welcome. The halls of Faldara Keep, their smooth stone walls sparsely decorated with elegantly simple tapestries and painted screens, bustled with news of the Amyrlin seat's imminent arrival. Servants in black and gold darted about their tasks, running to prepare rooms or carry orders to the kitchens, moaning that they could not have everything ready for so great a personage when they had had no warning. Dark-eyed warriors, their heads shaven except for a top knot bound with a leather cord, did not run, but haste filled their steps, and their faces shone with an excitement normally reserved for battle. Some of the men spoke as Rand hurried past. Ah, there you are, Randalthor. Peace favor your sword. On your way to clean up? You'll want to look your best when you're presented to the Amyrlin seat. She'll want to see you and your two friends as well as the women, you can count on it. He trotted toward the broad stairs, wide enough for 20 men abreast, that led up to the men's apartments. The Amyrlin herself, come with no more warning than a pack peddler. Must be because of Moiraine Sedai and you Southerners, eh? What else? The wide, iron-bound doors of the men's apartments stood open and half-jammed with top-knotted men buzzing with the Amyrlin's arrival. Ho, Southlander! The Amyrlin's here. Come for you and your friends, I suppose. Peace. What honor for you. She seldom leaves Tavalin, and she's never come to the borderlands in my memory. He fended them all off with a few words. He had to wash, find a clean shirt, no time to talk. They thought they understood and let him go. Not a one of them knew a thing except that he and his friends traveled in company with an Aes Sedai, that two of his friends were women who were going to Tar-Valon to train as Aes Sedai, but their words stabbed at him as if they knew everything. She's come for me. He dashed through the men's apartments, darted into the room he shared with Matt and Perrin, and froze, his jaw dropping in astonishment. The room was filled with women wearing the black and gold, all working purposefully. It was not a big room, and its windows, a pair of tall, narrow arrow slits looking down on one of the inner courtyards, did nothing to make it seem larger. 3 beds on black and white tiled platforms, each with a chest at the foot, 3 plain chairs, a washstand by the door, and a tall, wide wardrobe crowded the room. The 8 women in there seemed like fish in a basket. The women barely glanced at him and went right on clearing his clothes, and Matt and Perrin's, out of the wardrobe and replacing them with new. Anything found in the pockets was put atop the chests, and the old clothes were bundled up carelessly like rags. What are you doing? He demanded when he caught his breath. Those are my clothes. One of the women sniffed and poked a finger through a tear in the sleeve of his only coat, then added it to the pile on the floor. Another, a black-haired woman with a big ring of keys at her waist, set her eyes on him. That was Elansu, Chatayan of the keep. He thought of the sharp-faced woman as a housekeeper, though the house she kept was a fortress and scores of servants did her bidding. Moiraine Sedai said all of your clothes are worn out, and the Lady Amalisa had new made to give you. Just keep out of our way, she added firmly, and we will be done the quicker. There were a few men the Chatayan could not bully into doing as she wished. Some said even Lord Agilmar, and she plainly did not expect any trouble with one man young enough to be her son. He swallowed what he had been going to say. There was no time for arguing. The Amyrlin seat could be sending for him at any minute. Honor to the Lady Amalisa for her gift, he managed, after the Shinaran way. And honor to you, Elansu Chatayan. Please convey my words to the Lady Amalisa, and tell her I said, heart and soul to serve. That ought to satisfy the Shinaran love of ceremony for both women. But now, if you'll pardon me, I want to change. That is well, Elansu said comfortably. Moiraine Sedai said to remove all the old, every stitch. Small clothes, too. Several of the women eyed him sideways. None of them made a move toward the door. He bit his cheek to keep from laughing hysterically. Many ways were different in Shinar from what he was used to, and there were some to which he would never become accustomed if he lived forever. He had taken to bathing in the small hours of the morning, when the big, tiled pools were empty of people, after he discovered that at any other time, a woman might climb into the water with him. It could be a scullion or the Lady Amalisa, Lord Agilmar's sister herself. The baths were one place in Shinar where there was no rank. Expecting him to scrub her back in return for the same favor, asking him why his face was so red, had he taken too much sun? They had soon learned to recognize his blushes for what they were, and not a woman in the keep, but seemed fascinated by them. I might be dead or worse in another hour, and they're waiting to see me blush. He cleared his throat. If you'll wait outside, I'll pass the rest out to you. On my honor. One of the women gave a soft chortle, and even Elansu's lips twitched, but the Chatayan nodded and directed the other women to gather up the bundles they had made. She was the last to leave, and she paused in the doorway to add, the boots, too. Moiraine Sedai said everything. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. His boots, at least, were certainly still good, made by Alwyn Alvan, the cobbler back in Emmons Field, and well broken in and comfortable. But if giving up his boots would make the Chatayan leave him alone so he could go, he would give her the boots and anything else she wanted. He had no time. Yes, of course. On my honor. He pushed on the door, forcing her out. Alone, he dropped onto his bed to tug off his boots. They were still good, a little worn, the leather cracked here and there, but still wearable and well broken in to fit his feet. Then hastily stripped off, piling everything atop the boots, and washed at the basin just as quickly. The water was cold. The water was always cold in the men's apartments. The wardrobe had 3 wide doors carved in the simple Shinaran manner, suggesting more than showing a series of waterfalls and rocky pools. Pulling open the center door, he stared for a moment at what had replaced the few garments he had brought with him. A dozen high-collared coats of the finest wool, and as well cut as any he had ever seen on a merchant's back or a lord's, most embroidered like feast day clothes. A dozen. 3 shirts for every coat, both linen and silk, with wide sleeves and tight cuffs. 2 cloaks. 2, when he had made do with 1 at a time all his life. 1 cloak was plain, stout wool and dark green, the other deep blue with a stiff-standing collar embroidered in gold with herons. And high on the left breast, where a lord would wear his sign, his hand drifted to the cloak of its own accord. As if uncertain what they would feel, his fingers brushed the stitching of a serpent, curled almost into a circle, but a serpent with 4 legs and a lion's golden mane, scaled in crimson and gold, its feet each tipped with 5 golden claws. His hand jerked back as if burned. Light, help me. Was it Amalisa had this made, or Moiraine? How many saw it? How many know what it is, what it means? Even one is too many. Burn me, she's trying to get me killed. Bloody Moiraine won't even talk to me, but now she's giving me bloody fine new clothes to die in. A rap at the door sent him leaping half out of his skin. Are you done? Came Elansu's voice. Every stitch now. Perhaps I had better... A creak as if she were trying the knob. With a start, Rand realized he was still naked. I'm done, he shouted. Peace! Don't come in! Hurriedly, he gathered up what he had been wearing, boots and all. I'll bring them. Hiding behind the door, he opened it just wide enough to shove the bundle into the arms of the Shatayan. That's everything. She tried to peer through the gap. Are you sure? Moiraine said I said everything. Perhaps I had better just look. It's everything, he growled, on my honor. He shouldered the door shut in her face and heard laughter from the other side. Muttering under his breath, he dressed hurriedly. He would not put it past any of them to find some excuse to come bulling in anyway. The gray breeches were snugger than he was used to, but still comfortable, and the shirt with its billowy sleeves was wide enough to satisfy any good wife in Emmonsfield on laundry day. The knee-high boots fit as if he had worn them a year. He hoped it was just a good cobbler, and not more Aes Sedai work. All of these clothes would make a pack as big as he was. Yet he had grown used to the comfort of clean shirts again, of not wearing the same breeches day after day until sweat and dirt made them as stiff as his boots, then wearing them still. He took his saddlebags from his chest and stuffed what he could into them, then reluctantly spread the fancy cloak out on the bed and piled a few more shirts and breeches on that. Folded with the dangerous sigil inside and tied with a cord, looped so it could be slung on a shoulder, it looked not much different from the packs he had seen carried by other young men on the road. A peal of trumpets rolled through the arrow slits, trumpets calling the fanfare from outside the walls, trumpets answering from the keep towers. I'll pick out the stitching when I get a chance, he muttered. He had seen women picking out embroidery when they had made a mistake or changed their mind on the pattern, and it did not look very hard. The rest of the clothes, most of them in fact, he stuffed back into the wardrobe. No need to leave evidence of flight to be found by the first person to poke a head in after he went. Still frowning, he knelt beside his bed. The tiled platforms on which the beds rested were stoves, where a small fire damped down to burn all night could keep the bed warm through the worst night in a Shannara winter. The nights were still cooler than he was used to this time of year, but blankets were enough for warmth now. Pulling open the firebox door, he took out a bundle he could not leave behind. He was glad Elansu had not thought anyone would keep clothes in there. Setting the bundle atop the blankets, he untied one end and partially unfolded it. A gleeman's cloak turned inside out to hide the hundreds of patches that it covered, patches in every size and color imaginable. The cloak itself was sound enough. The patches were a gleeman's badge. Had been a gleeman's badge. Inside nestled 2 hard leather cases. The larger held a harp, which he never touched. The harp was never meant for a farmer's clumsy fingers, boy. The other, long and slim, contained the gold and silver chased flute he had used to earn his supper and bed more than once since leaving home. Tom Amyrlin had taught him to play that flute before the Gleeman died. Rand could never touch it without remembering Tom, with his sharp blue eyes and his long white mustaches, shoving the bundled cloak into his hands and shouting for him to run. And then Tom had to run himself, knives appearing magically in his hands as if he were performing, to face the Myrddraal that was coming to kill them. With a shiver, he redid the bundle. It's all over with. Thinking of the wind on the tower top, he added, strange things happen this close to the Blight. He was not sure he believed it, not the way Lan had apparently meant it. In any case, even without the Amyrlin seat, it was past time for him to be gone from Faldara. Shrugging into the coat he had kept out, it was a deep, dark green and made him think of the forests at home, Tam's Westwood farm where he had grown up, and the Waterwood where he had learned to swim. He buckled the heron-marked sword to his waist and hung his quiver, bristling with arrows, on the other side. His unstrung bow stood propped in the corner with mats and parens, the stave 2 hands taller than he was. He had made it himself since coming to Faldara, and besides him, only Lan and Perrin could draw it. Stuffing his blanket roll and his new cloak through the loops on his bundles, he slung the pair from his left shoulder, tossed his saddlebags atop the cords, and grabbed the bow. Leave the sword arm free, he thought. Make them think I'm dangerous. Maybe somebody will. Cracking the door revealed the hall all but empty. One liveried servant dashed by, but he never so much as glanced at Rand. As soon as the man's rapid footfalls faded, Rand slipped out into the corridor. He tried to walk naturally, casually, but with saddlebags on his shoulder and bundles on his back, he knew he looked like what he was, a man setting out on a journey and not meaning to come back. The trumpets called again, sounding fainter here inside the keep. He had a horse, a tall bay stallion, in the north stable, called the Lord's Stable, close by the Sally Gate that Lord Ogilmar used when he went riding. Neither the Lord of Faldara nor any of his family would be riding today, though, and the stable might be empty except for the stable boys. There were 2 ways to reach the Lord's Stable from Rand's room. One would take him all the way around the keep, behind Lord Ogilmar's private garden, then down the far side and through the farrier's smithy, likewise certainly empty now, to the stable yard. Time enough that way for orders to be given for a search to start before he reached his horse. The other was far shorter. First across the outer courtyard, or even now the Amyrlin seat was arriving with another dozen or more Aes Sedai. His skin prickled at the thought. He had had more than enough of Aes Sedai for any sane lifetime. One was too many. All the stories said it, and he knew it for a fact. But he was not surprised when his feet took him toward the outer courtyard. He would never see legendary Tarvalin. He could not afford that risk, now or ever. But he might catch a glimpse of the Amyrlin seat before he left. That would be as much as seeing a queen. There can't be anything dangerous in just looking from a distance. I'll keep moving and be gone before she ever knows I was there. He opened a heavy iron-strapped door onto the outer courtyard and stepped out into silence. People forested the guard walk atop every wall. Top-knotted soldiers and liveried servants, and menials still in their muck, all pressed together cheek by jowl, with children sitting on shoulders to look over their elders' heads or squeezing in to peer around waists and knees. Every archer's balcony was packed like a barrel of apples, and faces even showed in the narrow arrow slits in the walls. A thick mass of people bordered the courtyard like another wall. And all of them watched and waited in silence. He pushed his way along the wall, in front of the smithies and Fletcher's stalls that lined the court. Faldara was a fortress, not a palace, despite its size and grim grandeur, and everything about it served that end. apologizing quietly to the people he jostled. Some looked around with a frown, and a few gave a second stare to his saddlebags and bundles, but none broke the silence. Most did not even bother to look at who had bumped past them. He could easily see over the heads of most of them, enough to make out clearly what was going on in the courtyard. Just inside the main gate, a line of men stood beside their horses, 16 of them. No two wore the same kind of armor or carried the same sort of sword, and none looked like Lan, but Rand did not doubt they were warders. Round faces, square faces, long faces, narrow faces, they all had the look as if they saw things other men did not see, heard things other men did not hear. Standing at their ease, they looked as deadly as a pack of wolves. Only one other thing about them was alike. One and all, they wore the color-shifting cloak he had first seen on Lan, the cloak that often seemed to fade into whatever was behind it. It did not make for easy watching or a still stomach, so many men in those cloaks. A dozen paces in front of the warders, a row of women stood by their horses' heads, the cowls of their cloaks thrown back. He could count them now. 14. 14 Aes Sedai. They must be. Tall and short, slender and plump, dark and fair, hair cut short or long, hanging loose down their backs or braided. Their clothes were as different as the warders were, in as many cuts and colors as there were women. Yet they too had a sameness, one that was only obvious when they stood together like this. To a woman they seemed ageless. From this distance he would have called them all young, but closer he knew they would be like Moiraine. Young-seeming, yet not. Smooth-skinned, but with faces too mature for youth. Eyes too knowing. Closer? Fool? I'm too close already. Burn me, I should have gone the long way. He pressed on toward his goal, another iron-bound door at the far end of the court, but he could not stop looking. Calmly, the Aes Sedai ignored the onlookers and kept their attention on the curtained palanquin, now in the center of the courtyard. The horses bearing it held as still as if ostlers stood at their harness. But there was only one tall woman beside the palanquin, her face an Aes Sedai's face, and she paid no mind to the horses. The staff she held upright before her with both hands was as tall as she, the gilded flame capping it standing above her eyes. Lord Agelmar faced the palanquin from the far end of the court, bluff and square and face unreadable. His high-collared coat of dark blue bore the 3 running red foxes of the House of Jagad, as well as the stooping black hawk of Shinar. Beside him stood Ronan, age-withered but still tall. 3 foxes carved from red avatine topped the tall staff the Shambayan bore. Ronan was Elansu's equal in ordering the keep, Shambayan and Shatayan, but Elansu left little for him except ceremonies and acting as Lord Agelmar's secretary. Both men's top-knots were snow white. All of them, the warders, the Aes Sedai, the Lord of Faldara, and his Shambayan, stood as still as stone. The watching crowd seemed to hold its breath. Despite himself, Rand slowed. Suddenly Ronan rapped his staff loudly 3 times in the broad paving stones, calling into the silence, "Who comes here? Who comes here? Who comes here?" The woman beside the palanquin tapped her staff 3 times in reply. "The Watcher of the Seals, the Flame of Tar-Valon, the Amyrlin seat." "Why should we watch?" Ronan demanded. "For the hope of humankind," the tall woman replied. "Against what do we guard?" "The shadow at noon." "How long shall we guard?" From rising sun to rising sun, so long as the wheel of time turns. Agelmar bowed, his white topknot stirring in the breeze. Faldara offers bread and salt and welcome. Welcome is the Amyrlin seat to Faldara. For here is the watch kept, here is the pact maintained. Welcome. The tall woman drew back the curtain of the palanquin, and the Amyrlin seat stepped out. Dark-haired, ageless as all Aes Sedai were ageless, she ran her eyes over the assembled watchers as she straightened. Rand flinched when her gaze crossed him. He felt as if he had been touched, but her eyes passed on and came to rest on Lord Agelmar. A liveried servant knelt at her side with folded towels, steam still rising, on a silver tray. Formally, she wiped her hands and patted her face with a damp cloth. I offer thanks for your welcome, my son. May the light illumine House Jagad. May the light illumine Faldara and all her people. Agelmar bowed again. You honor us, mother. It did not sound odd, her calling him son or him calling her mother, though comparing her smooth cheeks to his craggy face made him seem more like her father or even grandfather. She had a presence that more than matched his. House Jagad is yours. Faldara is yours. Cheers rose on every side, crashing against the walls of the keep like breaking waves. Shivering, Rand hurried toward the door to safety, careless of whom he bumped into now. Just your bloody imagination. She doesn't even know who you are. Not yet. Blood and ashes if she did. He did not want to think of what would have happened if she knew who he was, what he was. What would happen when she finally found out? He wondered if she had had anything to do with the wind atop the tower. Aes Sedai could do things like that. When he pushed through that door and slammed it shut behind him, muting the roar of welcome that still shook the courtyard, he heaved a relieved sigh. The halls here were as empty as the others had been, and he all but ran. Out across a smaller courtyard with the fountain splashing in the center, down yet another corridor, and out into the flagstone stable yard. The Lord's stable itself, built into the wall of the keep, stood tall and long, with big windows here inside the walls, and horses kept on 2 floors. The smithy across the courtyard stood silent, the farrier and his helpers gone to see the welcome. Tima, the leathery-faced head groom, met him at the wide doors with a deep bow, touching his forehead and then his heart. Spirit and heart to serve you, my lord. How may Tima serve, my lord? No warrior's topknot here. Tima's hair sat on his head like an inverted gray bowl. Rand sighed. For the 100th time, Tima, I am not a lord. As my lord wishes. The groom's bow was even lower this time. It was his name that caused the problem, and a similarity. Randall Thor, Lan Mandragoran. For Lan, according to the custom of Malkir, the royal Al named him king, though he never used it himself. For Rand, Al was just a part of his name, though he heard that once, long ago, before the Two Rivers was called the Two Rivers, it had meant son of. Some of the servants in Faldara Keep, though, had taken it to mean he was a king too, or at least a prince. All of his argument to the contrary had only managed to demote him to lord. At least he thought it had. He had never seen quite so much bowing and scraping, even with Lord Agelmar. I need red saddled, Tima. He knew better than to offer to do it himself. Tima would not let Rand soil his hands. I thought I'd spend a few days seeing the country around the town. Once he was on the big bay stallion's back, a few days would see him at the river Aranin, or across the border into Arafel. They'll never find me then. The groom bent himself almost double and stayed bent. Forgive, my lord, he whispered hoarsely. Forgive. But Tima cannot obey. Flushing with embarrassment, Rand took an anxious look around. There was no one else in sight, then grabbed the man's shoulder and pulled him upright. He might not be able to stop Tima and a few others from acting like this, but he could try to stop anyone else from seeing it. Why not, Tima? Tima, look at me, please. Why not? It is commanded, my lord, Tima said, still whispering. He kept dropping his eyes, not afraid, but ashamed that he could not do what Rand asked. Shienarans took shame the way other people took being branded a thief. No horse may leave this stable until the order is changed. Nor any stable in the keep, my lord. Rand had his mouth open to tell the man it was all right, but instead he licked his lips. No horse from any stable? Yes, my lord. The order came down only a short time ago. Only moments. Tima's voice picked up strength. All the gates are closed as well, my lord. None may enter or leave without permission. Not even the city patrol, so Tima has been told. Rand swallowed hard, but it did not lessen the feeling of fingers clutching his windpipe. The order, Tima. It came from Lord Agomar? Of course, my lord. Who else? Lord Agomar did not speak the command to Tima, of course, nor even to the man who did speak it to Tima, but, my lord, who else could give such a command in Faldara? Who else? Rand jumped as the biggest bell in the keep bell tower let out a sonorous peal. The other bells joined in, then bells from the town. If Tima may be bold, the groom called above the reverberations. My lord must be very happy. Rand had to shout back to be heard. Happy? Why? The welcome is finished, my lord. Tima's gesture took in the bell tower. The Amyrlin seat will be sending for my lord and my lord's friends to come to her now. Rand broke into a run. He just had time to see the surprise on Tima's face, and then he was gone. He did not care what Tima thought. She will be sending for me now. Chapter 3. Friends and Enemies. Rand did not run far, only as far as the Sally gate around the corner from the stable. He slowed to a walk before he got there, trying to appear casual and unhurried. The arched gate was closed tight. It was barely big enough for two men to ride through abreast, but like all the gates in the outer wall, it was covered with broad strips of black iron and locked shut with a thick bar. Two guards stood before the gate in plain conical helmets and plate and mail armor with long swords on their backs. Their golden surcoats bore the black hawk on the chest. He knew one of them slightly, Ragan. The scar from a Trolloc arrow made a white triangle against Ragan's dark cheek behind the bars of his face guard. The puckered skin dimpled with a grin when he saw Rand. Peace favor you, Randalthor. Ragan almost shouted to be heard over the bells. Do you intend to hit rabbits over the head, or do you still insist that club is a bow? The other guard shifted to stand more in front of the gate. Peace favor you, Ragan, Rand said, stopping in front of them. It was an effort to keep his voice calm. You know it's a bow. You've seen me shoot it. No good from a horse, the other guard said sourly. Rand recognized him now, with his deep-set, almost black eyes that never seemed to blink. They peered from his helmet like twin caves inside another cave. He supposed there could be worse luck for him than Masema guarding the gate, but he was not sure how, short of a red Aes Sedai. It's too long, Masema added. I can shoot 3 arrows with a horse bow while you loose 1 with that monster. Rand forced a grin, as if he thought it was a joke. Masema had never made a joke in his hearing, nor laughed at one. Most of the men at Faldara accepted Rand. He trained with Lan, and Lord Agilmar had him at table. And most important of all, he had arrived at Faldara in company with Moiraine and Aes Sedai. Some seemed unable to forget his being an outlander, though, barely saying 2 words to him, and then only if they had to. Masema was the worst of those. "It's good enough for me," Rand said. "Speaking of rabbits, Ragan, how about letting me out? All this noise and bustle is too much for me. Better to be out hunting rabbits even if I never see one." Ragan half turned to look at his companion, and Rand's hopes began to lift. Ragan was an easygoing man, his manner belying his grim scar, and he seemed to like Rand. But Masema was already shaking his head. Ragan sighed. "It cannot be, Randall Thor." He gave a tiny nod toward Masema as if to explain. If it were up to him alone. "No one is to leave without a written pass. Too bad you did not ask a few minutes ago. The command just came down to bar the gates." "But why would Lord Agilmar want to keep me in?" Masema was eyeing the bundles on Rand's back and his saddlebags. Rand tried to ignore him. "I'm his guest," he went on to Ragan. "By my honor, I could have left any time these past weeks. Why would he mean this order for me? It is Lord Agilmar's order, isn't it?" Masema blinked at that, and his perpetual frown deepened. He almost appeared to forget Rand's packs. Ragan laughed. "Who else could give such an order, Randall Thor? Of course, it was Uno who passed it to me, but whose order could it have been?" Masema's eyes, fixed on Rand's face, did not blink. "I just want to go out by myself, that's all," Rand said. "I'll try one of the gardens then. No rabbits, but at least there won't be a crowd. The light illumine you and peace favor you." He walked away without waiting for an answering blessing, resolving not to go near any of the gardens on any account. Burn me. Once the ceremonies are done, there could be Aes Sedai in any of them. Aware of Masema's eyes on his back, he was sure it was Masema, he kept his pace normal. Suddenly the bells stopped ringing, and he skipped a step. Minutes were passing, a great many of them. Time for the Amyrlin seat to be shown to her chambers. Time for her to send for him. To start a search when he was not found. As soon as he was out of sight of the Sally Gate, he began to run again. Near the barracks kitchens, the Carter's Gate, where all the foodstuffs for the keep were brought in, stood closed and barred behind a pair of soldiers. He hurried past across the kitchen yard as if he had never meant to stop. The dog gate at the back of the keep, just high enough and wide enough for one man on foot, had its guards too. He turned around before they saw him. There were not many gates, even as big as the keep was, but if the dog gate was guarded, they all would be. Perhaps he could find a length of rope. He climbed one of the stairs to the top of the outer wall, to the wide parapet with its crenellated walls. It was not comfortable for him being so high and exposed if that wind came again, but from there he could see across the tall chimneys and sharp roofs of the town all the way to the city wall. Even after nearly a month, the houses still looked odd to his Two Rivers eyes, eaves reaching almost to the ground, as if the houses were all wood-shingled roof and chimneys angled to let heavy snow slide past. A broad paved square surrounded the keep, but only 100 paces from the wall lay streets full of people going about their daily business, aproned shopkeepers out under the awnings in front of their shops, rough-clothed farmers in town to buy and sell, hawkers and tradesmen and townspeople gathered in knots, no doubt to talk about the surprise visit from the Amyrlin seat. He could see carts and people flowing through one of the gates in the town wall. Apparently the guards there had no orders about stopping anyone. He looked up at the nearest guard tower. One of the soldiers raised a gauntleted hand to him. With a bitter laugh, he waved back. Not a foot of the wall but was under the eyes of guards. Leaning through an embrasure, he peered down past the slots in the stone for setting hoardings, down the sheer expanse of stone to the dry moat far below. 20 paces wide and 10 deep, faced with stone polished slippery smooth. A low wall slanted to give no hiding place, surrounded it to keep anyone from falling in by accident, and its bottom was a forest of razor-sharp spikes. Even with a rope to climb down and no guards watching, he could not cross that. Would serve to keep Trollocs out in the last extreme, served just as well to keep him in. Suddenly he felt weary to the bone, drained. The Amyrlin seat was there, and there was no way out. No way out, and the Amyrlin seat there. If she knew he was there, if she had sent the wind that had seized him, then she was already hunting him. Hunting with an Aes Sedai's powers. Rabbits had more chance against his bow. He refused to give up, though. There were those who said Two Rivers folk could teach stones and give lessons to mules. When there was nothing else left, Two Rivers people hung on to their stubbornness. Leaving the wall, he wandered through the keep. He paid no mind to where he went, so long as it was nowhere he would be expected. Not anywhere near his room, nor any of the stables, nor any gate. Masima might risk Uno's tongue to report him trying to leave, nor garden. All he could think of was keeping away from any Aes Sedai. Even Moiraine. She knew about him. Despite that, she had done nothing against him. So far as you know. What if she's changed her mind? Maybe she sent for the Amyrlin seat. For a moment, feeling lost, he leaned against the corridor wall, the stone hard under his shoulder. Eyes blank, he stared at a distant nothing and saw things he did not want to see. Gentled. Would it be so bad to have it all over? Really over? He closed his eyes, but he could still see himself huddling like a rabbit with nowhere left to run, and Aes Sedai closing around him like ravens. They almost always die soon after, men who've been gentled. They stop wanting to live. He remembered Tom Merlin's words too well to face that. With a brisk shake, he hurried on down the hall. No need to stay in one place until he was found. How long till they find you anyway? You're like a sheep in a pen. How long? He touched the sword hilt at his side. No, not a sheep. Not for Aes Sedai or anybody else. He felt a little foolish, but determined. People were returning to their tasks. A din of voices and clattering pots filled the kitchen that lay nearest the great hall, where the Amyrlin seat and her party would feast that night. Cooks and scullions and potboys all but ran at their work. The spit dogs trotted in their wicker wheels to turn the spitted meats. He made his way quickly through the heat and steam, through the smells of spices and cooking. No one spared him a second glance. They were all too busy. The back halls, where the servants lived in small apartments, were stirring like a kicked ant heap as men and women scurried to don their best livery. Children did their playing in corners, out of the way. Boys waved wooden swords, and girls played with carved dolls, some announcing that hers was the Amyrlin seat. Most of the doors stood open, doorways blocked only by beaded curtains. Normally, that meant whoever lived there was open to visitors, but today it simply meant the residents were in a hurry. Even those who bowed to him did so with hardly a pause. Would any of them hear, when they went to serve, that he was being sought, and speak of seeing him? Speak to an Aes Sedai and tell her where to find him? The eyes that he passed suddenly appeared to be studying him slyly, and to be weighing and considering behind his back. Even the children took on sharper looks in his mind's eye. He knew it was just his imagination. He was sure it was. It had to be. But when the servants' apartments were behind him, he felt as if he had escaped before a trap could spring shut. Some places in the keep were empty of people, the folk who normally worked there released for the sudden holiday. The armorer's forge, with all the fires banked, the anvils silent. Silent, cold, lifeless. Yet somehow not empty. His skin prickled, and he spun on his heel. No one there. Just the big square tool chests and the quenching barrels full of oil. The hair on the back of his neck stirred, and he whipped round again. The hammers and tongs hung in their places on the wall. Angrily, he stared around the big room. There's nobody there. It's just my imagination. That wind and the Amyrlin. That's enough to make me imagine things. Outside in the armorer's yard, the wind swirled up around him momentarily. Despite himself, he jumped, thinking it meant to catch him. For a moment, he smelled the faint odor of decay again, and heard someone behind him laughing slyly. Just for a moment. Frightened, he edged in a circle, peering warily. The yard, paved with rough stone, was empty except for him. Just your bloody imagination. He ran away, and behind him he thought he heard the laughter again, this time without the wind. In the woodyard, the presence returned, the sense of someone there, the feel of eyes peering at him around tall piles of split firewood under the long sheds, darting glances over the stacks of seasoned planks and timbers waiting on the other side of the yard for the carpenter's shop, now closed up tight. He refused to look around, refused to think of how one set of eyes could move from place to place so fast, could cross the open yard from the firewood shed to the lumber shed without even a flicker of movement that he could see. He was sure it was one set of eyes. Imagination. Maybe I'm going crazy already. He shivered. Not yet. Light, please, not yet. Stiff-backed, he stalked across the woodyard, and the unseen watcher followed. Down deep corridors lit only by a few rush torches, in the storerooms filled with sacks of dried peas or beans, crowded with slatted racks heaped with wrinkled turnips and beets, or stacked with barrels of wine and casks of salted beef and kegs of ale, the eyes were always there, sometimes following him, sometimes waiting when he entered. He never heard a footstep but his own, never heard a door creak except when he opened and closed it. But the eyes were there. Light, I am going crazy. Then he opened another storeroom door, and human voices, human laughter drifted out to fill him with relief. There would be no unseen eye here. He went in. Half the room was stacked to the ceiling with sacks of grain. In the other half, a thick semicircle of men knelt in front of one of the bare walls. They all seemed to wear the leather jerkins and bowl-cut hair of menials. No warrior's top-knots, no livery. No one who might betray him accidentally. What about on purpose? The rattle of dice came through their soft murmurs, and somebody let out a raucous laugh at the throw. Loyal was watching them dice, rubbing his chin thoughtfully with a finger thicker than a big man's thumb, his head almost reaching the rafters nearly 2 spans up. None of the dicers gave him a glance. Ogier were not exactly common in the borderlands, or anywhere else, but they were known and accepted here, and Loyal had been in Faldara long enough to excite little comment. The Ogier's dark, stiff-collared tunic was buttoned up to his neck and flared below the waist over his high boots, and one of the big pockets bulged and sagged with the weight of something. Books, if Rand knew him. Even watching men gamble, Loyal would not be far from a book. In spite of everything, Rand found himself grinning. Loyal often had that effect on him. The Ogier knew so much about some things, so little about others, and he seemed to want to know everything. Yet Rand could remember the first time he ever saw Loyal, with his tufted ears and his eyebrows that dangled like long mustaches, and his nose almost as wide as his face. Saw him and thought he was facing a Trolloc. It still shamed him. Ogier and Trollocs. Myrddraal and things from the dark corners of midnight tales. Things out of stories and legends. That was how he had thought of them before he left Emond's Field. But since leaving home, he had seen too many stories walking in the flesh ever to be so sure again. Aes Sedai and unseen watchers, and a wind that caught and held. His smile faded. All the stories are real, he said softly. Loyal's ears twitched, and his head turned toward Rand. When he saw who it was, the Ogier's face split in a grin, and he came over.
Ah, there you are.
His voice was a deep bumblebee rumble.
I did not see you at the welcome. That was something I had not seen before. Two things. The Shienaran welcome and the Amyrlin seat. She looks tired, don't you think? It cannot be easy being Amyrlin. Worse than being an elder, I suppose.
He paused with a thoughtful look, but only for a breath.
Tell me, Rand, do you play at dice too? They play a simpler game here with only 3 dice. We use 4 in the steading. They won't let me play, you know. They just say glory to the builders and will not bet against me. I don't think that's fair, do you? The dice they use are rather small.
He frowned at one of his hands, big enough to cover a human head.
But I still think...
Rand grabbed his arm and cut him off. The builders. Loyal. Ogier built Faldara, didn't they? Do you know any way out except by the gates? A crawl hole, a drain pipe, anything at all? If it's big enough for a man to wiggle through. Out of the wind would be good too. Loyal gave a pained grimace, the ends of his eyebrows almost brushing his cheeks.
Rand, Ogier built Mathil Dadaranel, but that city was destroyed in the Trolloc Wars. This,
he touched the stone wall lightly with broad fingertips,
was built by men. I can sketch a plan of Mathil Dadaranel. I saw the maps once in an old book in Steading Shangtai. But of Faldara, I know no more than you. It is well built, though, isn't it? Stark, but well made.
Rand slumped against the wall, squeezing his eyes shut. I need a way out, he whispered. The gates are barred and they won't let anyone pass. But I need a way out.
But why, Rand?
Loyal said slowly.
No one here will hurt you.
I think this ogre's voice sucks compared to the last ogre's voice. That voice sung in my ears. This voice stings my eardrums.
Are you all right, Rand?
Suddenly his voice rose.
Matt, Baron, I think Rand is sick.
Rand opened his eyes to see his friends straightening up out of the knot of dicers. Matt Cawthon, long-limbed as a stork, wearing a half-smile as if he saw something funny that no one else saw. Shaggy-haired Perrin Aybara, with heavy shoulders and thick arms from his work as a blacksmith's apprentice. They both still wore their Two Rivers garb, plain and sturdy, but travel-worn. Matt tossed the dice back into the semicircle as he stepped out, and one of the men called, Here, Southlander, you can't quit while you're winning. Better than when I'm losing, Matt said with a laugh. Unconsciously, he touched his coat at the waist, and Rand winced. Matt had a dagger with a ruby in its hilt under there, a dagger he was never without, a dagger he could not be without. It was a tainted blade from the dead city of Shadar Logoth, tainted and twisted by an evil almost as bad as the Dark One, the evil that had killed Shadar Logoth 2,000 years before, yet still lived among the abandoned ruins. That taint would kill Matt if he kept the dagger. It would kill him even faster if he put it aside. You'll have another chance to win it back. Wry snorts from the kneeling men indicated they did not think there was much chance of that. Perrin kept his eyes down as he followed Matt across to Rand. Perrin always kept his eyes down these days, and his shoulders sagged as if he carried a weight too heavy even for their width. "What's the matter, Rand?" Matt asked. "You're as white as your shirt. Hey, where did you get those clothes? You turning Shinaran? Maybe I'll buy myself a coat like that and a fine shirt." He shook his coat pocket, producing a clink of coins. "I seem to have luck with the dice. I can hardly touch them without winning." "You don't have to buy anything," Rand said tiredly. "Moiraine had all our clothes replaced. They're burned already for all I know. All but what you two are wearing. Elan Sue will probably be around to collect those too, so I'd change fast if I were you, before she takes them off your back." Perrin still did not look up, but his cheeks turned red. Matt's grin deepened, though it looked forced. They too had had encounters in the baths, and only Matt tried to pretend it did not matter. "And I'm not sick. I just need to get out of here. The Amyrlin seat is here. Lan said... He said with her here, it would be better for me if I were gone a week. I need to leave, and all the gates are barred." "He said that?" Matt frowned. "I don't understand. He'd never say anything against an Aes Sedai. Why now?" "Look, Rand, I don't like Aes Sedai any more than you do, but they aren't going to do anything to us." He lowered his voice to say that, and looked over his shoulder to see if any of the gamblers was listening. Feared the Aes Sedai might be, but in the borderlands, they were far from being hated, and a disrespectful comment about them could land you in a fight or worse. "Look at Moiraine. She isn't so bad, even if she is Aes Sedai. You're thinking like old Sen Bowie telling his tall tales back home in the Wine Spring Inn. I mean, she hasn't hurt us, and they won't. Why should they?" Perrin's eyes lifted. Yellow eyes gleaming in the dim light like burnished gold. Moiraine hasn't hurt us, Rand thought. Perrin's eyes had been as deep a brown as Matt's when they left the Two Rivers. Rand had no idea how the change had come about. Perrin did not want to talk about it, or about very much of anything since it happened. But it had come at the same time as the slump in his shoulders, and a distance in his manner as if he felt alone, even with friends around him. Perrin's eyes and Matt's dagger. Neither would have happened if they had not left Emond's Field, and it was Moiraine who had taken them away. He knew that was not fair. They would probably all be dead at Trollocs' hands, and a good part of Emond's Field as well if she had not come to their village. But that did not make Perrin laugh the way he used to, or take the dagger from Matt's belt. And me, if I was home and still alive, would I still be what I am now? At least I wouldn't be worrying about what the Aes Sedai are going to do to me. Matt was still looking at him quizzically, and Perrin had raised his head enough to stare from under his eyebrows. Loyal waited patiently. Rand could not tell them why he had to stay away from the Amyrlin seat. They did not know what he was. Lan knew, and Moiraine, and Egwene and Nynaeve. He wished none of them knew, and most of all he wished Egwene did not. But at least Matt and Perrin, and Loyal too, believed he was still the same. He thought he would rather die than let them know, than see the hesitation and worry he sometimes caught in Egwene's eyes and Nynaeve's, even when they were trying their best. "Somebody's watching me," he said finally. "Following me. Only there's nobody there." Perrin's head jerked up, and Matt licked his lips and whispered, "A Fade?"
"Of course not," Loyal snorted. "How could one of the eyeless enter Faldara, town or keep? By law, no one may hide his face inside the town walls, and the lamplighters are charged with keeping the streets lit at night, so there isn't a shadow for a Myrddraal to hide in. It could not happen."
"Walls don't stop a Fade," Matt muttered. "Not when it wants to come in. I don't know as laws and lamps will do any better." He did not sound like someone who had half thought Fades were only Gleeman's tales less than half a year before. He had seen too much too. "And there was the wind," Rand added. His voice hardly shook as he told what had happened on the tower top. Perrin's fists tightened until his knuckles cracked. I just want to leave here, Rand finished. I want to go south. Somewhere away. Just somewhere away. But if the gates are barred, Matt said, how do we get out? Rand stared at him. We? He had to go alone. It would be dangerous for anyone near him eventually. He would be dangerous, and even Moiraine could not tell him how long he had. Matt, you know you have to go to Tarvalin with Moiraine. She said that's the only place you can be separated from that bloody dagger without dying. And you know what will happen if you keep it. Matt touched his coat over the dagger, not seeming to realize what he was doing. An Aes Sedai's gift is bait for a fish, he quoted. Well, maybe I don't want to put the hook in my mouth. Maybe whatever she wants to do in Tarvalin is worse than if I don't go at all. Maybe she's lying. The truth an Aes Sedai tells is never the truth you think it is. You have any more old sayings you want to rid yourself of? Rand asked. A south wind brings a warm guest, a north wind an empty house. A pig painted gold is still a pig. What about talk shears no sheep? A fool's words are dust. Easy, Rand, Perrin said softly. There is no need to be so rough. Isn't there? Maybe I don't want you two going with me, always hanging around, falling into trouble and expecting me to pull you out. You ever think of that? Burn me, did it ever occur to you I might be tired of always having you there whenever I turn around? Always there, and I'm tired of it. The hurt on Perrin's face cut him like a knife, but he pushed on relentlessly. There are some here think I'm a lord. A lord. Maybe I like that. But look at you, dicing with stable hands. When I go by myself. You two can go to Tarvalin or go hang yourselves. But I leave here alone. Matt's face had gone stiff, and he clutched the dagger through his coat till his knuckles were white. If that is how you want it, he said coldly. I thought we were... However you want it, old Thor. But if I decide to leave at the same time you do, I'll go. And you can stand clear of me. Nobody is going anywhere, Perrin said, if the gates are barred. He was staring at the floor again. Laughter rolled from the gamblers against the wall as someone lost.
Go or stay, Loyal said. Together or apart, it doesn't matter. You are all three Tavirin. Even I can see it, and I don't have that talent. Just by what happens around you. And Moiraine Sedai says it too.
Matt threw up his hands. No more, Loyal. I don't want to hear about that anymore. Loyal shook his head.
Whether you hear it or not, it is still true. The wheel of time weaves the pattern of the age, using the lives of men for thread. And you three are Tavirin, center points of the weaving.
No more, Loyal.
For a time, the wheel will bend the pattern around you three, whatever you do. And whatever you do is more likely to be chosen by the wheel than by you. Tavirin pull history along behind them and shape the pattern just by being, but the wheel weaves Tavirin on a tighter line than other men. Wherever you go, and whatever you do, until the wheel chooses otherwise, you will...
No more, Matt shouted. The men dicing looked around, and he glared at them until they bent back to their game.
I am sorry, Matt, Loyal rumbled. I know I talk too much, but I did not mean...
I'm not staying here, Matt told the rafters, with a big-mouthed Ogier and a fool whose head is too big for a hat. You coming, Perrin? Perrin sighed, and glanced at Rand, then nodded. Rand watched them go with a stick caught in his throat. I must go alone. Light help me, I have to. Loyal was staring after them too, eyebrows drooping worriedly.
Rand, I really didn't mean to.
Rand made his voice harsh. What are you waiting for? Go on with them. I don't see why you're still here. You're no use to me if you don't know a way out. Go on. Go find your trees and your precious groves, if they haven't all been cut down. And good riddance to them if they have. Loyal's eyes, as big as cups, looked surprised and hurt at first. But slowly they tightened into what almost might be anger. Rand did not think it could be. Some of the old stories claimed Ogier were fierce, though they never said how exactly, but Rand had never met anyone as gentle as Loyal.
If you wish it so, Randall Thor, Loyal said stiffly. He gave a rigid bow and stalked away after Matt and Perrin. Rand slumped against the stacked sacks of grain. "Well," a voice in his head taunted, "you did it, didn't you?" "I had to," he told it. "I will be dangerous just to be around. Blood and ashes. I'm going to go mad and... No, I won't. I will not use the power, and then I won't go mad, and... But I can't risk it. I can't, don't you see?" But the voice only laughed at him. The gamblers were looking at him, he realized. All of them, still kneeling against the wall, had turned to stare at him. Shienarans of any class were almost always polite and correct, even to blood enemies, and Ogier were never any enemies of Shienar. Shock filled the gamblers' eyes. Their faces were blank, but their eyes said what he had done was wrong. Part of him thought they were right, and that drove their silent accusation deep. They only looked at him, but he stumbled out of the storeroom as if they were chasing him. Numbly, he went on through the storerooms, hunting a place to secret himself until some traffic was allowed through the gates again. Then he could hide in the bottom of a vittler's cart, maybe, if they did not search the carts on the way out. If they did not search the storerooms, search the whole keep for him. Stubbornly, he refused to think about that. Stubbornly concentrated on finding a safe place. But every place he found, a hollow in a stack of grain sacks, a narrow alley along the wall behind some wine barrels, an abandoned storeroom half filled with empty crates and shadows, he could imagine searchers finding him there. He could imagine that unseen watcher, whoever it was, or whatever, finding him there too. So he hunted on, thirsty and dusty and with cobwebs in his hair. And then he came out into a dimly torchlit corridor, and Egwene was creeping along it, pausing to peer into the storerooms she passed. Her dark hair, hanging to her waist, was caught back with a red ribbon, and she wore a goose-gray dress in the Shienaran fashion, trimmed in red. At the sight of her, sadness and loss rolled over him, worse than when he had chased Matt and Perrin and Loyal away. He had grown up thinking he would marry Egwene one day. They both had. But now... She jumped when he popped out right in front of her, and her breath caught loudly, but what she said was, "So there you are! Matt and Perrin told me what you did. And Loyal. I know what you're trying to do, Rand, and it is plain foolish." She crossed her arms under her breasts, and her big, dark eyes fixed him sternly. He always wondered how she managed to seem to be looking down at him. She did it at will, although she was only as tall as his chest, and 2 years younger besides. "Good," he said. Her hair suddenly made him angry. He had never seen a grown woman with her hair unbraided until he left the Two Rivers. There, every girl waited eagerly for the women's circle of her village to say she was old enough to braid her hair. Egwene certainly had. And here she was with her hair loose except for a ribbon. "I want to go home and can't, and she can't wait to forget Emmons Field." "You go away and leave me alone too. You don't want to keep company with a shepherd anymore. There are plenty of Aes Sedai here for you to moon around now. And don't tell any of them you saw me. They're after me, and I don't need you helping them." Bright spots of color bloomed in her cheeks. "Do you think I would—" He turned to walk away, and with a cry she threw herself at him, flung her arms around his legs. They both tumbled to the stone floor, his saddlebags and bundles flying. He grunted when he hit, sword hilt digging into his side, and again when she scrabbled up and plopped herself down on his back as if he were a chair. "My mother," she said firmly, "always told me the best way to learn to deal with a man was to learn to ride a mule. She said they have about equal brains most of the time. Sometimes the mule is smarter." He raised his head to look over his shoulder at her. "Get off me, Egwene. Get off! Egwene, if you don't get off—" He lowered his voice ominously. "I'll do something to you. You know what I am." He added a glare for good measure. Egwene sniffed. "You wouldn't if you could. You would not hurt anybody. But you can't anyway. I know you cannot channel the one power whenever you want. It just happens, and you cannot control it. So you are not going to do anything to me or anybody else. I, on the other hand, have been taking lessons with Moiraine. So if you don't listen to some sense, Randall Thor, I might just set your britches on fire.
I can manage that much. You keep on as you are and see if I cannot." Suddenly, for just a moment, the torch nearest them on the wall flared up with a roar. She gave a squeak and stared at it, startled. Twisting around, he grabbed her arm, pulled her off his back, and sat her against the wall. When he sat up himself, she was sitting there across from him, rubbing her arm furiously. "You really would have, wouldn't you?" he said angrily. "You're fooling with things you don't understand. You could have burned both of us to charcoal." Men. When you cannot win an argument, you either run away or resort to force. Hold on there. Who tripped who? Who sat on who? And you tried to... He raised both hands. "No, you don't. You do this to me all the time. Whenever you realize the argument isn't going the way you want, suddenly we are arguing about something else completely. Not this time." "I am not arguing," she said calmly, "and I am not changing the subject either. What is hiding except running away? And after you hide, you'll run away for true. And what about hurting Matt and Perrin and Loyal? And me? I know why. You're afraid you will hurt somebody even worse if you let them stay near you. If you don't do what you shouldn't, then you don't have to worry about hurting anybody. All this running around and striking out, and you don't even know if there's a reason. Why should the Amyrlin, or any Aes Sedai but Moiraine, even know you exist?" For a moment, he stared at her. The longer she spent with Moiraine and Nynaeve, the more she took on their manner, at least when she wanted to. They were much alike at times, the Aes Sedai and the Wisdom, distant and knowing. It was disconcerting coming from Egwene. Finally, he told her what Lan had said. What else could he mean? Her hand froze on his arm, and she frowned with concentration. "Moiraine knows about you, and she hasn't done anything. So why should she now? But if Lan..." Still frowning, she met his eyes. "The storerooms are the first place they will look, if they do look. Until we find out if they are looking, we need to put you somewhere they would never think of searching." "I know. The dungeon." He scrambled to his feet. "The dungeon? Not in a cell, silly. I go there some evenings to visit Confronting Fain. Nynaeve does too. No one will think it odd if I go early today. In truth, with everybody looking to the Amyrlin, no one will even notice us. But Moiraine, she doesn't go to the dungeons to question Master Fain. She has him brought to her. And she has not done that very much for weeks. Believe me, you'll be safe there." Still he hesitated. Confronting Fain. Why do you visit the peddler anyway? He's a dark friend, admitted out of his own mouth, and a bad one. Burn me, Egwene, he brought the Trollocs to Emond's Field. The Dark One's hound, he called himself, and he has been sniffing on my trail since winter night. Well, he is safe behind iron bars now, Rand. It was her turn to hesitate, and she looked at him, almost pleading. Rand, he has brought his wagon into the Two Rivers every spring since before I was born. He knows all the people I know, all the places. It's strange, but the longer he has been locked up, the easier in himself he has become. It's almost as if he is breaking free of the Dark One. He laughs again and tells funny stories about Emond's Field folk, and sometimes about places I never heard of before. Sometimes he is almost like his old self. I'd just like to talk to somebody about home. Since I've been avoiding you, he thought, and since Perrin's been avoiding everybody, and Matt's been spending all his time gambling and carousing. I shouldn't have kept to myself so much, he muttered, then sighed. Well, if Moiraine thinks it's safe enough for me, but there's no need for you to be mixed in it. Egwene got to her feet and concentrated on brushing off her dress, avoiding his eye. Moiraine has said it's safe. Egwene? Moiraine Sedai has never told me I could not visit Master Fain, she said carefully. He stared at her, then burst out. You never asked her. She doesn't know. Egwene, that's stupid. Confronting Fain's a dark friend, and as bad as ever a dark friend was. He is locked in a cage, she said stiffly, and I do not have to ask Moiraine's permission for everything I do. It is a little late for you to start worrying about doing what an Aes Sedai thinks, isn't it? Now, are you coming? I can find the dungeon without you. They are looking for me, or will be, and it won't do any good to be found with me. Without me, she said dryly, You'll likely trip over your own feet and fall on the Amyrlin seat's lap, then confess everything while trying to talk your way out of it. Blood and ashes. You ought to be in the women's circle back home. If men were all as fumble-footed and helpless as you seem to think, we'd never... Are you going to stand here talking until they do find you? Pick up your things, Rand, and come with me. Not waiting for an answer, she spun around and started off down the hall. Muttering under his breath, he reluctantly obeyed. There were a few people, servants mainly, in the back ways they took, but Rand had the feeling that they all took special notice of him. Not notice of a man burdened for a journey, but of him, Randolph Thor in particular. He knew it was his imagination, he hoped it was, but even so he felt no relief when they stopped in a passageway deep beneath the keep, before a tall door with a small iron grill set in it, as thickly strapped with iron as any in the outer wall. A clapper hung below the grill. Through the grill, Rand could see bare walls and two top-knotted soldiers sitting bareheaded at a table with a lamp on it. One of the men was sharpening a dagger with long, slow strokes of a stone. His strokes never faltered when Egwene rapped with the clapper, a sharp clang of iron on iron. The other man, his face flat and sullen, looked at the door as if considering, before he finally rose and came over. He was squat and stocky, barely tall enough to look through the cross-hatched bars. "What do you want?" "Oh, it's you again, girl. Come to see your dark friend? Who's that?" He made no move to open the door. "He's a friend of mine, Changu. He wants to see Master Fain, too." The man studied Rand, his upper lip quivering back to bare teeth. Rand did not think it was supposed to be a smile. "Well," Changu said finally. "Well, tall, aren't you? Tall, and fancy dressed for your kind. Somebody catch you young on the eastern marches and tame you?" He slammed back the bolts and yanked open the door. "Well, come in if you're coming." He took on a mocking tone. "Take care not to bump your head, my lord." There was no danger of that. The door was tall enough for Loyal. Rand followed Egwene in, frowning and wondering if this Changu meant to make some sort of trouble. He was the first rude Shinaran Rand had met, and even Massimo was only cold, not really rude. But the fellow just banged the door shut and rammed the heavy bolts home, then went to some shelves beyond the end of the table and took one of the lamps there. The other man never ceased stropping his knife, never even looked up from it. The room was bare except for the table and benches and shelves, with straw on the floor, and another iron-bound door leading deeper in. "You'll want some light, won't you?" Changu said. "In there in the dark with your dark friend." He laughed, coarse and humorless, and lit the lamp. "He's waiting for you." He thrust the lamp at Egwene and undid the inner door almost eagerly. "Waiting for you. In there. In the dark." Rand paused uneasily at the blackness beyond and Changu grinning behind, but Egwene caught his sleeve and pulled him in. The door slammed, almost catching his heel. The latch bars clanged shut. There was only the light of the lamp, a small pool around them in the darkness. "Are you sure he'll let us out?" he asked. The man had never even looked at his sword or bow, he realized, never asked what was in his bundles. They aren't very good guards. We could be here to break Fain free for all he knows. "They know me better than that," she said, but she sounded troubled, and she added, "They seem worse every time I come. All the guards do, meaner and more sullen. Changu told jokes the first time I came, and Adao never even speaks anymore. But I suppose working in a place like this can't give a man a light heart. Maybe it's just me. This place does not do my heart any good either." Despite her words, she drew him confidently into the black. He kept his free hand on his sword. The pale lamplight showed a wide hall, with flat iron grills to either side, fronting stone-walled cells. Only two of the cells they passed held prisoners. The occupants sat up on their narrow cots as the light struck them, shielding their eyes with their hands, glaring between their fingers. Even with their faces hidden, Rand was sure they were glaring. Their eyes glittered in the lamplight. That one likes to drink and fight, Egwene murmured, indicating a burly fellow with sunken knuckles. This time, he wrecked the common room of an inn in the town single-handed and hurt some men badly. The other prisoner wore a gold-embroidered coat with wide sleeves and low, gleaming boots. He tried to leave the city without settling his inn bill. She sniffed loudly at that. Her father was an innkeeper as well as mayor of Emond's Field, nor paying half a dozen shopkeepers and merchants what he owed. The men snarled at them, guttural curses as bad as any Rand had heard from merchants' guards. "They grow worse every day, too," she said in a tight voice, and quickened her step. She was enough ahead of him when they reached Confronting Fain's cell at the very end that Rand was out of the light entirely. He stopped there, in the shadows behind her lamp. Fain was sitting on his cot, leaning forward expectantly as if waiting, just as Changu had said. He was a bony, sharp-eyed man with long arms and a big nose, even more gaunt now than Rand remembered. Not gaunt from the dungeon. The food here was the same as the servants ate, and not even the worst prisoner was shorted. But from what he had done before coming to Faldara. The sight of him brought back memories Rand would just as soon have done without. Fain on the seat of his big peddler's wagon, wheeling across the wagon bridge, arriving in Emond's Field the day of winter night. And on winter night the Trollocs came, killing and burning, hunting. Hunting 3 young men, Moiraine had said. Hunting me if they only knew it, and using Fain for their trailhound. Fain stood at Egwene's approach, not shielding his eyes or even blinking at the light. He smiled at her, a smile that touched only his lips, then raised his eyes above her head. Looking straight at Rand, hidden in the blackness behind the light, he pointed a long finger at him. "I feel you there, hiding, Rand al'Thor," he said, almost crooning. "You can't hide. Not from me, and not from them. You thought it was over, did you not? But the battle's never done, al'Thor. They are coming for me, and they are coming for you, and the war goes on. Whether you live or die, it's never over for you. Never." Suddenly he began to chant. "Soon comes the day all shall be free, even you and even me. Soon comes the day all shall die. Surely you, but never I." He let his arm fall, and his eyes rose to stare intently at an angle up into the darkness. A crooked grin twisting his mouth, he chuckled deep in his throat as if whatever he saw was amusing. "Mordeth knows more than all of you. Mordeth knows." Egwene backed away from the cell until she reached Rand, and only the edge of the light touched the bars of Fain's cell. Darkness hid the peddler, but they could still hear his chuckles. Even unable to see him, Rand was sure Fain was still peering off at nothing. With a shiver, he pried his fingers off his sword hilt. "Light," he said hoarsely. "This is what you call being like he used to be. Sometimes he's better and sometimes worse." Egwene's voice was unsteady. "This is worse. Much worse than usual. What is he seeing, I wonder? He's mad, staring at a stone ceiling in the dark. If the stone weren't there, he'd be looking straight at the women's apartments, where Moiraine is, and the Amyrlin seat." He shivered again. "He's mad. This is not a good idea, Rand." Looking over her shoulder at the cell, she drew him away from it and lowered her voice as if afraid Fain might overhear. Fain's chuckles followed them. "Even if they don't look here, I cannot stay here with him like this. And I do not think you should either. There is something about him today that—" She drew a shaky breath. "There's one place even safer from search than here. I did not mention it before because it was easier to get you in here, but they will never look in the women's apartments. Never." "The women's—" "Egwene, Fain may be mad, but you are madder. You can't hide from hornets in a hornet's nest. What better place? What is the one part of the keep no man will enter without a woman's invitation? Not even Lord Agomar. What is the one place no one would ever think to look for a man? What is the one place in the keep sure to be full of Aes Sedai? It is crazy, Egwene." Poking at his bundles, she spoke as if it were all decided. You must wrap your sword and bow in your cloak, and then it will look as if you're carrying things for me. It should not be too hard to find you a jerkin and a shirt that isn't so pretty. You will have to stoop, though. I told you I won't do it. Since you're acting stubborn as a mule, you should take right to playing my beast of burden. Unless you would really rather stay down here with him. Fain's laughing whisper came through the black shadows. The battle's never done, Althor. Mordeth knows. I'd have a better chance jumping off the wall, Rand muttered. But he unslung his bundles and set about wrapping sword and bow and quiver, as she had suggested. In the darkness, Fain laughed. It's never over, Althor. Never.